Thank you, and I am truly honored to be able to have this conversation with you, Nicola, because we served partly during the same years. However, your experience is extremely, I could call you a pillar of experience because you were elected to the Scottish Parliament in the last century, in 1999, actually.
So, thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, I know.
I thought you were a friend.
Yeah, yeah. Well, she wasn't too happy about me mentioning this, but Nicola will be leaving the Scottish Parliament next May. So that's 27 years of serving. Yeah. And please, can you... Yeah, exactly. It's a long time for any politician, and especially a long time for a female politician. So can you just tell me a little bit to begin with how you experience the changes that have happened during that time?
Well, thank you, and it's so lovely to be here chatting to you. Over the course of my life in politics, the 27 years in Parliament and almost 10 years as First Minister, I mean, I've witnessed so much change, good change and, unfortunately, some bad change as well. When I reflect on my earlier days in politics, and particularly my earlier days as First Minister, it seemed then that the progress towards gender equality, or something much closer to gender equality in politics, was not a completed journey, but it was one that was definitely heading in the right direction, and the pace of it had accelerated. It felt that we were getting close to a critical mass of women in politics, and that was changing the environment and the culture of politics quite markedly. When I was leader of my party, First Minister of Scotland, all three of the main political parties in Scotland at that time were led by women. There were, at the time I held office, a number of very prominent, high-profile women in leadership positions across the world. You, obviously, Angela Merkel, Jacinda Ardern. And so it seemed as if we were going in the right direction. Today, I think it feels less like that. All of the political parties now in my country have gone from being led by women to all being led by men now.
There are fewer female leaders.
There are fewer female leaders globally. Yeah. And most worryingly of all, we live in a time when the climate of politics, the political discourse, has become almost hostile to women. And I think social media and the changing way in which we debate and interact with each other is contributing greatly to that. I talk to a lot of younger women at home, and I feel and detect a real reluctance to go into not just politics, but public life in any form, because there is a sense that it will be somewhere that you get abuse, your privacy is completely obliterated, and that it's very difficult to live your life in any with any semblance of sanity. So I think it is a much more difficult time now for women in politics. I don't want to be overly pessimistic, though, because I think, and I've listened to some of the discussions already today, history teaches us that progress is very rarely linear. It's often the case that progress is made and then suddenly it hits a backlash and a pushback. And at these moments, I think it is important not to become dispirited. It's important to decide, and I heard somebody use this phrase earlier on, to mount a backlash against the backlash. And for women to support other women, for men to support women, and for us to redouble our efforts to go in the right direction.
The media environment, you mentioned that has changed. The traditional media environment has changed. The social media and the emergence of them. I was just telling somebody yesterday that I was one of the first Icelandic parliamentarians to enter Facebook in 2007. And then we had a few election campaigns that were mainly on Facebook, and now we have a vast array of social media which really can decide on success in politics. So do you think, because of course male politicians also get their share of hostility on social media, but how would you define the difference between men and women when it comes to the discussion on social media?
I think, everybody who has any degree of prominence attracts abuse and hostility on social media. But I don't think I am in any way exaggerating or getting this wrong to say that women and minorities suffer much, much more of that than men, than certainly white men do. And that makes it a much more difficult arena to be in. You know, social media, I was one of the first prominent Scottish politicians to campaign on Twitter.
Yeah.
I rarely go anywhere near Twitter or X or whatever it's called. So social media has gone from being a force for good, I think, you know, platforms that help democratise debate, to now being, I think, one of the biggest dangers for the future of democracy. And that doesn't have to be the case. It's because social media platforms are owned and controlled by the Elon Musks of this world. They are deliberately using those platforms to sow division, to drive people apart, and to make politics inhospitable for the kind of people they don't want to be in politics. And so I think one of the challenges, I don't have the magic answer, but certainly if we're going to continue to be able to encourage women into politics, is to find a way of making these spaces for debate much more civilised again. And I think that's important for women, but actually it's important for the future of democracy, which, you know, it seems absurd to be even saying this, but I think in countries all over the world right now, democracy really is in peril. And
we are seeing democracy
we really
on
need to
decline.
pay attention to that.
Yeah, I was one of the politicians that spoke about social media as the new kind of platform for democracy. Yeah. But I also sincerely believe that the younger generation will handle it, because I already see some signs of the younger generation. They are treating it carefully, the discussion on social media. So let's stay optimistic on that one. But you were a leader for a long time. You put a lot of issues on the agenda. The well-being economy, which was a collaboration between Scotland, New Zealand and Iceland, gender equality, climate issues. Many of those issues we haven't seen really progress in these issues since you left the Scottish government, because these were kind of issues that you were pushing as a female leader.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us really about the lessons learned from your leadership and putting new approaches on the agenda?
I mean, I think we're seeing regression in all of these issues across the world. You know, COP, the last time I spoke in this room, it was just before COP26 in Glasgow, where we had the opportunity to meet. And back then, it looked as if there was a real consensus behind the vital nature of climate action.
Yeah.
You know, COP30 is meeting in Brazil right now, and the world is going backwards on climate action. The same is true on gender equality, on well-being, and there has been an attempt, mainly by men and male leaders, to wrap all of these issues into a culture war and brand all of these issues as wokery and the kind of issues that are soft, that take people's leaders' eyes off the economy, when in actual fact, making sure women can participate in the labour force just as easily as men, making sure we have a planet to leave to future generations, making sure the economy works for everyone, these are all issues that matter to the health of the economy in any country.
Were you criticised for being soft?
So that's the other point I think is important. Many of these issues are described and characterised as women's issues. And we still talk about women's issues in a way, or men and some women still talk about these issues as if they are not serious or as serious as hard-edged issues of business and the economy. And I think that is one of the problems. And you know, one of the things as I reflect back on my time in leadership, and I think it's relevant to this discussion, every leader should listen to criticism, and every leader should pay attention to criticism. But there's an old adage that I think everybody should live by, that you should not pay too close attention to criticism from people that you wouldn't go to for advice. And there is also, I think, something that, and this would be my advice to future leaders, particularly future women leaders, just because you face an onslaught of criticism on, you know, the well-being economy or on climate policy or on gender equality, just because you face that onslaught of criticism doesn't necessarily mean you are wrong. What it is more likely to mean sometimes is that you are challenging vested, established interests. And if we're going to make the world a better place in future, it's really important to challenge established vested interests. And so don't give up on these issues.
But I bet it was sometimes difficult to think that during the time that you were facing the criticism, because I know that from my own experience, it's not easy to stand tall in front of criticism, even though you have the sincere conviction that you're doing the right thing.
Absolutely, and I'm about to generalise here, and it's important not to do that too much. But I think, generally speaking, women find that criticism harder to deal with than men.
Yeah.
Many men are brought up to believe that they have a right to be in positions of power, and therefore they are there, on merit, and it is something that is their birthright. Women, I think, in general, don't have that. So more women will feel an ever-present sense of imposter syndrome, a sense of, am I really good enough to be here? So
and did you experience that?
Absolutely, yeah.
The imposter syndrome? Okay.
Absolutely, all of my life. And but I think it's important for women who've held positions of leadership to be honest about that, so that younger women, because often I think younger women will look at people like us and think, well, I couldn't do that. Yeah. They're so confident, they are so assured. And so I think it's important to be open and say, well, that might be how we present, but it's not always how we feel. And I used to think that sense of imposter syndrome was a handicap. Mm-hmm. I got to the point in my career where I changed my view and started to see it as a secret superpower. Because if you have that voice constantly questioning whether you deserve to be there, then you tend to push yourself harder and work harder. And I think a lot of women do that. So again, my advice to younger women is to embrace all of that and be yourself and have that confidence to
But it's true,
challenge.
Really, that, I remember beginning in politics that I was always super extra well prepared. Yeah. I read all the stuff and the material before every meeting, and then I came and met the men, and they kind of were opening up their envelopes and looking at the papers and saying,
when I used to interact with Boris Johnson, he didn't even bring an envelope.
Okay.
But it's a good example. When I was First Minister, I use the word interacted because it sounds the most neutral term I can use, with 5 British Prime Ministers.
Yes, they kept on changing them during that period.
The contrast between, I had political differences with all of them, but the contrast between somebody like Theresa May and Boris Johnson was stark. Theresa May, for all my political differences with her, she was always super prepared, on top of her brief, took the job and her responsibilities so seriously, and I respected that. Boris Johnson would turn up and ruffle his hair and make it clear and almost make a virtue of the fact that he was unprepared.
Not prepared, yes.
And
exactly.
Again, no woman would inarguably, no person should get away with that. So I think some of what, as women, we sometimes see as disadvantages, the self-doubt, imposter syndrome, the having to be over-prepared all of the time, we should shift our attitude to that and actually see that as our superpower.
As our
something
strength.
that is a good thing and actually the right way of doing the job.
Actually, yes. A final question, because our time soon will be up, but I can tell for myself that it's a very tough decision to leave politics, because politics kind of is your life, and you spend a large part of your life being a politician. Can you tell us very shortly how you reached that, how that decision feels to you now when you have decided and announced that you're leaving?
I mean, it is tough, and it was good to chat to you last night, because there are very few people in this world that you can talk to about the challenges of leaving high political office, and they know how it feels. Firstly, it's a great liberation in some ways. This is my 4th or maybe 5th visit to Iceland, and I thought last night it's the first time I've been able to actually wander around and see some of this beautiful place, because previous visits I've been First Minister and whisked from one place to another, surrounded by people. So it has huge advantages, but it's a very difficult transition to go from, being the leader of a country to being a citizen without all of that. And I think one of the challenges, particularly in the troubled world we live in, is how future leaders actually utilise that wealth of experience that leaders amass rather than have that lost. But yeah, as you and I both know, the transition from being First Minister, Prime Minister into post-politics life has its ups and downs.
Well, yeah. I remember waking up one morning and thinking, I'm a nobody heading nowhere, doing nothing. Wow, that's a change.
I'm not sure that's true, but the feeling of relief when you wake up in the morning and you hear about some crisis on the radio and the sort of adrenaline starts to flow and then you suddenly remember, not my problem anymore.
Yes, exactly. Not my problem. But Nicola, we could be here for a long time. Nicola, you just published a book. We're going to talk about that later in this week at the book festival Iceland Noir, where you actually just published a political memoir. But let's say, to conclude, I think the experience of you and myself, former female leaders, is something that should be used more. And I think we could actually use that experience to make the world better. So,
I hope so.
Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.